Hey surfers, it's good to be with you again. I'm your locutora, Valeria Vega. After an extended fall break, we are back this holiday season to encourage you, now that you're back in El Paisito for las fiestas, to pick up that copy of Diario El Salvador when you sit down with your abue in El Mister for cafecito en pan dulce and ask yourself, why does this read more like a brochure for El Salvador S.A. de CV than actual freaking news of what's going on in the country? And what has happened to all the other newspapers? Way back in episode 2, Elena laid out the clues we have about how much the Bukele administration is spending gassing itself up on social media. What we're talking about today, however, is what's going on with everyone else in the local media landscape. You know, the people that are supposed to seek truth and report it, according to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. To keep our questions going about why we're being kept in the dark on what's going on in El Salvador, we sit down with Humberto, a longtime freelance journalist, to explain where the Salvadoran media is at today with freedom of the press. We came to some disquieting conclusions in this episode, like that the Bukele administration isn't locking up journalists yet, not because they have a crush on democracy or anything, but maybe because it's easier to choke out local independent media by intimidating journalists into self-censoring and self-deporting than it is to just lead with arrests. And also that maybe in the age of disinformation and AI, we might need to go to bat for big corporate media to know what's actually happening in the world. Like, maybe El Salvador had a shitty but more functional balance of power before Bukele, when Grupo Lutris and the Altamiranos could blackmail the political class. It's kind of a cringe thought, very cringe thought, but unfortunately I have been thinking it since talking with Humberto. Draw your own conclusions and join us, surfistas, as we dive into the shallow end of the freedom of expression pool and look at why so many Salvadoran journalists are drying off lately and getting out of El Salvador. It's another scorcher here as we get ready to go live from Surf City. It's a shame you're not invited to the press conference. Okay, good morning, surfers. It is a beautiful day in Surf City. The sun is high. We're burning up a little bit. The tide is just perfect to dive right into this topic with our guest today, Humberto. Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Standing the heat.
Yeah, standing the heat in Surf City. So, allegedly, what we're here to talk about with Humberto is about freedom of the press. And so I'm going to start right off by asking you, why do you have so much to say about this topic?
To start, I'm a journalist covering politics here in El Salvador. And El Salvador has this long-running history with freedom of the press and censorship. So every government for at least El Salvador's democratic life has had issues with, not to say, the military governments prior to that, which have also been a part of this ongoing want to control mass media. And now, as we go into the 21st century, right, we're seeing how that displays not only through news outlets, but also through social media and sort of independent journalism, right?
And my understanding is you're a journalist, right? You've been doing this for a while. Can you talk a little bit about your trajectory?
Yeah, I've worked in El Salvador for more than a couple of years, writing for some big outlets in the regional and international space. And I've covered mostly politics-related topics. So that's a little bit of everything from government and lawmaking to some of the social conflict and human rights stories that El Salvador has been sort of the protagonist in for the last couple of years, especially during the last administration, right, which has had a ton of policies that have a big impact in the reshaping of El Salvador in many ways, including but not limited to journalism.
So it sounds like you can tell us you can paint a pretty good picture of a before and after this administration when it comes to journalism in the country.
Yeah, for sure. I think a big problem that sort of started to lead us here is that journalism, or at least like the mainstream media outlets, have depended on the government. So a lot of the money coming to the big outlet has come from advertising from the government. And that meant that the government always had a sort of like a bargaining chip, right, with media outlets. And Bukala knew this very well. So when he came into the government, sort of for the first year, he sort of played with it. And then eventually he decided it was not worth it. So he took all of, or most of the money that the government spent in advertising from the newspapers, most of the TV networks and radios, and they sort of created their own media space, right? So they started their own TV channel, their own newspaper, their own radio, and that way they sort of skipped the need to be spending their money in having the news play its role, delivering information and sort of doing it their own, right? Skipping that middleman to deliver information to the public. But of course, this wasn't filtered through journalists, so it was information that drove propaganda at the end. And that also meant that a lot of the news outlets, since they had such big budget cuts, they started to, lay people off. And it's been a tough era for mainstream and traditional news outlets because they're managing sort of the media crisis that has been going on for more than a couple of years, but also how they work around not having the government's money.
What about access? My understanding is that the FMLN or maybe even Arena governments were a bit friendlier to the press in terms of statements and, allowing them interviews and stuff. What has access for the press been like with the government?
Yeah, so access has been one of the things that I feel have changed more during this administration. So before, it was easy. If you're looking for a statement from the Ministry of Housing, you go to the Ministry of Housing and, they can tell you whether they give you some information or not. Also, there's a law in El Salvador for information access. And although the law is still exists, really no one's enforcing it, right? So that means everywhere from town hall to the executive branch, no one's really making the government hand out that information. And they fell in love with being able to classify information as confidential. And that has meant that they've sort of hid information starting somewhere around the times of the pandemic until now. And it's something that, usually confidential information means it has some ties to like national security, or it's information that it shouldn't reach the public because it can harm the state. Or the law was very focused on like not giving out like personal information, so that meant they wouldn't like put government workers at risk by letting people know like their salaries and addresses and some of their more but personal information. But we did know who was buying what companies were being hired. Now the government is sort of classifying everything as confidential information. So now if there's the Ministry of Public Infrastructure is gonna go and hire some contractor to do a highway, for example, they'll classify that information One example of this is a couple months ago, El Salvador's building this massive highway in Los Chorros that had some big infrastructure problems that led to some people being severely damaged and killed because they didn't follow some of the safety regulations they should have. And what the government did to sort of like mitigate this problem was, hide all the information under the carpet, mark it as confidential, and no one knows what's really going on. Same thing happened for the pandemic. Same thing has happened in many things. And also, this is something that the government, through the Attorney General's office, has used in many of the cases they're fighting in the courts, right? So what they'll do in cases where having information out can go back to them as in somewhat harmful way, right? They'll ask the court to make it unaccessible to anyone, right, including the press. So that means in big cases like Ruth Lopez, who has been arrested some weeks ago, we won't know anything about that court case because they sealed it, right? So it's something that they're using in different ways, so no one has access, although there's a law that should allow us to have access to all that information.
We mentioned Ruth Lopez's arrest a few episodes ago, but just to add some details. Ruth is an anti-corruption lawyer, most recently working with Cristosal representing victims of the state of exception, including the Venezuelan deportees who just testified about their time at Secot on ABC. She was on the BBC's 2024 list of most influential people in the world, and she was arrested by the Salvadoran government in May of this year. Unlike hundreds of thousands of other inmates, public pressure actually worked with Ruth and forced the government to let her see her family and a lawyer during her first week behind bars. Since then, however, those on the outside have only had a glimpse of Ruth during her preliminary hearing in June, where it was announced that the case would be processed bajo reserva, somewhere between confidential and restricted, which means the public has no right to know what's going on with the case, like why her original charges of embezzlement got switched to illicit enrichment, for example. When news of her case's secrecy broke, Ruth was seen being led into the courtroom in handcuffs, screaming, "No me van a callar! Un juicio público quiero!" Translation: they're not going to shut me up. I want a public trial. Queen shit. She recently won the Magnitsky Human Rights Award for her legal work, which of course her colleagues at Cristosal had to go to DC and accept in her name. And just to drive the point home, this was not the case, say, 6 years ago, I'm imagining. There was a lot more ability to get these kind of straight answers and facts, right, about just basic procedural stuff, right?
Yes, and it's sort of contradictory because, once you see the way this government works, you would think most governments would want to be that way.
Right. It seems really convenient for them.
It really is.
But, what we saw during the FMLN administration and also in a way during the Arena administration was that they were very forward to giving information to a press, despite that sort of meaning they got some bad press a lot of the time. Also, prior to the Bukele administration coming in, there was an easier approach to getting even off the record information. Public officials would be able to speak some truth without, getting in the midst of the storm. But that's something that has changed, and it has changed because the government has such control over its officials, their ministers, their workers, that they won't really even want to do off the record information because they're so afraid of having their phones tapped and the government or the attorney's office being able to know that they're talking to the press, leaking stuff. So that's sort of something that has been sort of void, right? Because no one really wants to speak because they're afraid.
Have there been any consequences for government officials or such to speaking with the press that you can think of?
I know there has been, at the beginning of the administration, there was quite a bit more government officials leaking stuff, right? Including, the New York Times just reported this truce that the Bukele administration had made with the MS-13, and one of the sources that we have to know that this actually happened was the director of the penitentiary system going to the US Embassy to leak this information, right? That allegedly happened in 2020. And from then on, after a lot of outlets have published hard-hitting pieces thanks to leaked information, we know that the government officials have closed off more and more to wanting to speak to the press. And yeah, we've seen that sort of come and go in different ways, but we do know that some government officials have been removed from their positions and sort of like casted to the shadows for speaking too much, right?
Can you think of any examples?
Yeah, there was this ministry, the first minister of security, Rogelio Rivas, who I think, some of his outcasting also has to do with him having like presidential aspirations, but he was quickly removed from the Ministry of Security and then thrown to the sharks, right? And
where is he now?
He was head of the direction of local development for a while, and then I, sort of lost track of him. He's not there anymore.
Gotcha, but definitely not like a big name job title anymore.
No, not anymore.
Yeah. Rogelio Rivas was the Minister of Public Safety from 2019 to 2021 when he was let go. Some say for speaking too candidly to the press, others for scheming on his presidential ambitions without clearing it with the Bukeles first. Regardless, I couldn't find what he's up to nowadays, other than still giving interviews to the press as a former Minister of Public Safety, this time talking about how successful Salvadoran prisons have been since they suspended family visits at the beginning of his mandate. So, this sounds like a scary situation for government workers. I'm assuming it's also a bit intimidating for journalists themselves, right? And their gumption for wanting to publish, those hard-hitting pieces anymore. What is censorship looking like for the Salvadoran press, like outside of what's run by the state?
Yeah, I think censorship is coming in many like colors and shapes and sizes, right? So in one hand, we have like censorship coming from the government sort of controlling all the information that comes out, right? So that means people don't really have access to like analyze data about anything that the government does, and that means the public never gets to know about it. That also means you won't get granted access to any of the stuff that the government is doing unless they can benefit from it, and they can sort of like lead the narrative on whatever that is. And that's why local media has sort of been shunned away from having access to anything related to the president, the government security policy, and most of the government's doing, right? So that means, you won't get invited to press conference. You won't be invited to see the government's big spending in security, right? Their jails, their raids. You won't be able to get access to documents from what the government purchases or who they hire. And that's sort of in the lighter side of things, but also the government has tougher ways to show or impose their censorship. So, we've had a couple of cases of police raiding journalists' houses, right? And I think we haven't seen the toughest face of repression yet, right? But it is starting to show its true face, right? There's a big problem in El Salvador, which is that El Salvador doesn't have freedom of press as a constitutional right. So yes, it has freedom of expression, but not freedom of the press. So that sort of like leaves it out to a lot of considerations from the courts to what is or isn't allowed. And in some instances, I know some journalists were called in a couple of years ago by the Attorney General's office in a trial where they wanted to, them to reveal their sources about something related to gangs, if I'm not mistaken. And that's the big discussion, right? You don't have the professional right to not reveal your sources and sort of like keep people safe, because the court could subpoena you and have you forced to expose that. You don't have the right in El Salvador. So that makes it sort of difficult. And I think that there's a problem with, that's not widely known even to journalists. So everyone sort of sees the movies where, the journalists say, "Oh, I'm not revealing my sources," but that's not something valid here. There's a lot of stuff in the toolbox that the government hasn't used yet, but they can and probably will at some point. And yes, I think we haven't seen the toughest hand they can deal yet.
Some of the greatest hits of journalistic intimidation in 2024 and 2025 include stationing army personnel outside the homes of reporters from Revista Elementos and La Prensa Gráfica, having the military detain journalists from Factum and foreign outlets and telling them to erase the content they had just recorded about Secot, government employees instructing journalists from El Faro that it's illegal to take pictures of the University of El Salvador, a public institution, and finally, raiding the home and seizing the equipment of a reporter from Radio Balsamo, a community-run radio station. Okay, so I really want to talk about the raids and such at some point, but I'm totally blown off track by what you just said. I didn't know that we didn't have freedom of the press as like a legal right in the country. I guess I want to ask you about what are kind of the legal protections that pertain to journalism and journalistic integrity. Like, do we have any? What kind of legal frameworks is the media operating under?
There really isn't much to protect the media. So I think prior to this, the media or traditional media has been run by a lot of the big names in the country's history, right?
Such as
the Dutris group, or the owners of Altamirano, the owners of Diario de Hoy. We also have like the Esersky family that runs TCS, the largest TV network in the country. And for a long time, especially during the governments of Arena, this is sort of like a group of its own running everything, right? Running the media, running the government. These big names of El Salvador's economic force were running stuff, and that meant they wouldn't really try to pursue anything against the press, or maybe not against the press as this like big conglomerate of journalists, but maybe if something happened with one journalist, they would find a way to intimidate them, whatever. And but now stuff has change, right? They're sort of losing their economic grip. There's new big economic force in the country that the Bukeles are sort of like headlining, and that has meant with this like restructuring of how the politics of the country work, that they are starting to look for all the non-existing legal protections that the press doesn't have. So I believe only like lawyers and doctors really have the right to claim this professional secret, right, in El Salvador. So that means, it's just a matter of time till the government decides, the Attorney General will ask a journalist to go on trial and reveal, their sources. Or also, as we were stating before, the Attorney General can find any quirky law that they'll want to apply, including this like there was a reform on media related to gangs. It sort of came with the state of exception, which is media outlets can't really big array of things, but you can't really like publish anything that depicts gangs, right? So a photo of a tattoo, a video of like a gang mural in a wall could be considered a crime to publish.
Wow. And this is since, do you know when that came into effect?
That law came into the effect, I believe, during the first year of the state of exception.
So it's still pretty new.
It's pretty new, but it's happening in this period of the country where no one sort of has the right to stand up to this law, right? So it's there. No one in the court system is gonna try to like have it annulled or something, and they have a complete majority in Congress, so that means also there won't be a legislative approach to having that like modify or anything, so it's totally there to be enforced. And yeah, so that means anything that could mean that you're allegedly supporting gangs because you're getting their message out by having anything related to the topic published would get you in some like big legal trouble, right?
So you're saying it's a law that hasn't been weaponized yet, but it could be.
So it's just a matter of time, till someone publishes something related to the gangs that the government doesn't like, and they'll say, you broke the law, you were helping the gangs by sharing their message to the world when you publish this, and that means you're a gang collaborator or whatever. And who knows how that plays out in the court, whether you'll be trialed with the new rules of the state of exception, and not having a hearing for more than 6 months, being in this sort of like null system where you sort of like disappear until either worst case scenarios come to mind, right?
So you get released, or maybe you pass away, or that type of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess how are journalists feeling about this landscape? I know you mentioned. I guess let's maybe back up a little bit. How often do these kinds of machete, hardline consequences fall on journalists? And I'm asking you because I also feel like, you're not really a sensationalist kind of person. So realistically, right, like how often do these kinds of really repressive reactions like happen against journalists?
That's an interesting topic. I think we were speaking about this with a couple colleagues a while back ago about should we use the word repression as easily as it's used, because we've had seen cases where fellow journalists from, let's say, El Diario de Hoy get like stopped and frisked by the police or the military for being in a place where they're doing some sort of operation. And it's easy to sort of call that an attack on press, and to some extent it is, but it also sort of takes the meaning away from the word, right? We haven't seen in a frequent manner the government using these like very hard cutting
ham-fisted, whatever,
Yeah.
iron fist, whatever fist metaphor.
Type of measures.
The government has other ways to do that, right? They, now with social media, they'll like harass people. They'll surely throw, some sort of threat via social media, but nothing has really sort of like translated to the real world. So it's their way of playing with repressive measures without really going
all out.
All out.
Yeah.
Right.
So we haven't seen journalists getting jailed for doing journalism activities yet, but we have seen, in a couple instances, not many, but police raiding their homes, taking hard drives, computers away, to, surely try to put a case together against them, but it hasn't happened yet, right? So we see them meddling in the pool of how, like, really hard persecution and repression looks like, but they haven't decided to go all at it yet.
So it sounds like it's more kind of building up the stakes of a hostile environment, right? To get people to self-censor, sorry, more so than like actually coming down like full force.
A great assessment. I think that's
not something that's completely new to this government, just that before that, as we were talking about, there were a bigger grasp from the traditional oligarchy and the economic groups of the country. So they would find like a way to censor them through their own news outlets, right? Or, self-censorship, I think it's happening more and more now in a way that the government maybe doesn't really even have to like put hands on.
Yeah, it doesn't have to like give orders, like you can't talk about this.
It's just something that,
people are very afraid of, including journalists. So they'll decide not to talk about stuff, right? And the people that do, knowing worst case scenario, they can go to jail, they can find themselves within one of these made up cases that the government has.
Do you have a sense from either talking to colleagues or because you might have experienced this yourself of any direct, we are not going to write about this kind of stuff happening within specific media outlets? Like, you don't have to name them, but, I'm just wondering if you've overheard any of these conversations happening, like within the editorial board of, I don't know, Factum or Diario de Hoy or something like that, right? Where like you've heard people tell their writers, like, no, we're not going there.
Not so far, or not in that like very direct way, but I know that some outlets try not to get too involved with certain stories, right? Especially stories where there's a direct relationship to the Bukele family. I know there's a lot of people afraid to go into that. Their businesses, there's a lot of stuff, allegedly on their, the closet there that people know and talk about it, but don't really want to publish because, they think it's, just sort of like poking the beast directly, right? So might as well not do it because it might be just that step that takes everything too far, right? A lot of people are sort of self-censoring themselves with certain stories, but I think mostly editorial boards in the main, at least for the newspapers, have tended to want to publish more hard-hitting stories, at least in the realm of like corruption and the impacts that policies like the state of exception is having. I know they've had the effort to like really center on that, but I also think they, they'll talk to the families of the people that have been jailed, but I think they would definitely have some second thoughts into playing around like with leaked information from, there has been a lot of leaked information from Guacamaya, the group of hackers.
Guacamaya is a hacktivist group that has gone to town on the security apparatuses of several different Latin American countries, including Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and El Salvador. Here, Guacamaya has leaked 4.24 terabytes of information from the Policía Nacional Civil and the Salvadoran Armed Forces. Two of the big findings from these leaks confirm the violent deaths of prisoners being held under the state of exception and their subsequent cover-ups, as well as the assignment of state-funded security details to a smorgasbord of questionable characters, like Venezuelan political advisors and a relative of Tony Saca linked to money laundering and drug trafficking.
And yeah, I think that's something that maybe that editorial boards haven't really thrown out there as a company policy, but I think their executives are probably thinking about it. I know of one outlet that had a major change. The person that was leading their editorial team, and they took him out because he was very interested in, those like hard corruption stories. And yeah, now he's somewhere else, and I bet he'll continue doing that work there. But slowly they're getting there, because they know now, especially with the Foreign Agents Act, they know that they can mess with the rest of their income, right? Because a lot of outlets in El Salvador, not excluding traditional outlets, have funding from out of the country.
This is actually something that we haven't talked about quite yet in the podcast, I think, because it's still so new and it's technically on the books right now, but it's like not fully applied yet because we're in the middle of a grace period as of this recording. But can you talk a little bit about that foreign agents law and how you feel like it might affect the media landscape or, freedom of the press, I guess, more generally?
Yeah, for sure. So this law came into effect a couple of weeks ago, and it sort of states for now that like NGOs and organizations having funds from abroad have to register with the Ministry of the Interior, and they get taxed, which will have a lot of consequences by itself. But then there is this big loophole in the law, which sort of says the government reserves the right to apply this law to whomever it chooses to. This has been played out by the government as this law to not have foreign entities play a role in the government or in the country's politics. And one hand, there was a bunch of USAID money funding NGOs in the country, but also there's a ton of foreign money going to media outlets and also to independent journalists, right? So that means big independent outlets such as El Faro and Factum get in the map of being able, or the government being able to sort of like cut down or close the faucet for their income, right, coming from abroad. But also papers like El Diario de Hoy and La Prensa Gráfica, which also receive some funds from grants, they also can get hit by this if the government decides to apply this law to journalism, right? So it's something that hasn't been used yet, but it can be used. And if it is used, I think that's sort of an endgame tool to close down any journalistic space that's somewhat independent, right? Because most of the news outlets that don't get money from the government get money from abroad. So that means, they could all get closed down very quickly.
Now that the Ley de Agentes Extranjeros, or Foreign Agents Law, has gone into effect, we have a clearer idea of its repercussions. For example, some international aid organizations have pulled out of the country, defunding Salvadoran civil society groups even more since USAID shut down earlier this year. As a result of this lack of funds and the stringent requirements that go along with registering an organization in the law's database, many groups have left the country, shut down altogether, or are operating on a purely volunteer basis, including legal aid foundations, hormone replacement therapy clinics, human rights organizations, and, of course, media outlets. Since this interview, the editorial boards of Factum, El Faro, Colectivo San Jacinto, and Gato Encerrado have gone into exile, along with a few dozen other journalists and the entire Salvadoran Press Association. So recently, the Salvadoran Press Association, APES, put out this statement saying that around 40 journalists have fled the country in recent weeks. And this seems to coincide more or less with when this law was approved. Do you feel like there's a relation? Do you feel like people are like panicking? Are these two separate things? And I guess I'll ask you later on, like, what do you make of this idea that like journalists are being displaced in general?
Yeah, I think everything is sort of related, or although there's, different stuff playing out. I just think during the last couple of weeks, we've had a ton of stuff happening in El Salvador. There was, of course, that foreign agents law being approved, but also we saw the arrest of prominent human rights activists, of constitutional lawyers. And I think this has a lot of the journalism world also sort of they're tiptoeing their way around to what this will look for journalism. I believe, yeah, there's a lot of people fleeing for different aspects, right? I wouldn't want to call everyone leaving the country politically persecuted journalist, but there's definitely political measures, government measures behind people fleeing. So that means, either that is that you believe the attorney general has ordered your arrest, to, the country's economy going under and people can't afford to leave in the country anymore, or to leave from journalism, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening that I think are hitting people in different ways and making them sort of take this option to flee. I believe there is a very clear case with journalists from El Faro, which have gotten into this like very open confrontation with the government, where the case could be made for them having to flee because they fear of persecution. I wouldn't be totally sure if that's something we can make for the rest of the 40 journalists. Right. But I think in some way there's definitely government policies behind them leaving the country, right? The fact that certain media outlets are starting to lay journalists off because they don't have the money, and that means that that's a consequence of the government not having ad spending in those outlets, or the fact that they can lose their funding if they use this foreign agent law, right? So I definitely think that they have some correlation to government policies, but not necessarily persecution as a measure, right?
Yeah, I feel like I remember during this time period, which was very recently, that there was all these rumors going around that mass arrests were happening, that the police were asking around for specific journalists. Do you feel like that plays into what we were talking about earlier about like we're just gonna up the hostile environment without actually doing anything? Because that was, I guess, my question when I was seeing all of these different like social media posts. I was like, is this actually happening, or is it just an attempt to get people to leave on their own, you know?
I think it's a big fear policy going on, right? So we've heard of cases where the police are going to check out people's homes and news outlets, the offices of newspapers and such, and not doing anything, right? But yeah, definitely the fact that they're even like showing up, or that you have the fear of them showing up, has to be a driving force for you to decide to leave the country. And I feel what goes through people's heads is, if I'm seeing that they've arrested someone like Ruth, right, who has this like huge international backing, and I'm not seeing anyone be able to push back against her arrest, well, then maybe I feel like no one's really gonna vouch for me and I'm gonna be left alone. And I think that, yeah, fear is definitely a factor of why someone would choose to leave the country, just because media doesn't really have an upper hand in making the government be flexible or not to let a journalist go if they are arrested. Like maybe that's something that could have been done before, but now definitely not. And I think, yeah, the fear of having no rule of law, no chance of having a fair trial. It's something that's going on, and people are definitely have that in mind when thinking about what they are going to publish, and also when thinking about like leaving the country or not.
How do you link this hostility towards the press happening here to like global trends about, the misinformation and lying liberal media? Because I feel like a lot of these, I don't know if talking points, but at least a lot of these actions echo stuff that's happening like in the US, for example, and a whole bunch of other places where like the media is now seen as like, I don't know.
The enemy.
Right,
Yeah,
the enemy.
sure.
There you go.
I believe there's a regional push for a new type of very far right politician, and we see some phases of this in America, right? Which, America going from like South America with Milei and Bolsonaro, and also, Donald Trump, and definitely Bukele, and they all sort of share this strategy of, first putting a ton of money into social network and social media, having their own like whole fake news structure working for them, and at the same time going in this like frontal campaign against traditional news outlets or independent news outlets, and pushing the fake news narrative, right? So yeah, we see a lot of similarities between all these governments. I believe it's something that is just sort of getting more and more complicated. Like, it's getting easier each day to have fake news going around, right? AI is definitely a big factor in how lies get spread very easily on the internet, and it's sort of like they all have the policy of overwhelming everyone so much, including the media itself, that it's hard to keep track of everything, including the fake stuff they're throwing online, and also having to receive all the attacks at the same time they're throwing out. So now we see, like in El Salvador, this is now not only happening to like local outlets. Bukele has had a big push against independent outlets like El Faro, but also, El Diario de Hoy, and those like more mainstream outlets pushing stories that can affect Bukele's images, but also now, the New York Times and ProPublica sharing those like very well investigative pieces on Bukele's truths with gangs, and they sort of just shrug it off and say, oh, they're republishing the same lies that other outlets have been telling people for the last couple of years, and they sort of like find this way to remove all sense of accreditation from the outlets, from the media, and that means to a big majority of the people that consume information, something published by one of these prestigious news outlets, whether foreign or national, they'll be dismissed and seen as an attack on the president, and therefore, a made up story.
That seems really effective, too, just to be like, that's not real, moving on, and then everyone's like, okay, I guess that I don't think the New York Times is like a real media outlet anymore, Like,
yeah, for sure.
If you haven't already, I highly, highly recommend checking out the New Yorker's and ProPublica's pieces that explain how the state of exception was brought about through government negotiations with MS-13, granting the gang greater privileges in prison and blocking their extradition to the United States. Real juicy stuff. Clearly easier to just pretend like neither of those articles exist than to try to refute all the evidence point by point. Anyway, the link for both pieces is in this episode's description for your holiday reading.
It's very effective because there's also like so much stuff going on that people, on the same day they'll see the New York Times publishing. And there's also a big point to be made with journalism being a very elite thing. A lot of people don't really have the time to read a 5,000 word piece, right? So not only it takes a lot of time and a lot of knowledge to be able to actually understand what they're talking about, not to exclude, but also the fact that these pieces are in English and there's a Spanish speaking country, it makes it really hard in the first place to the people to actually have access to reading one of these stories. But then if you do have access to reading one of these stories, you get confronted with the fact that on the same day you'll be bombarded by the government,
like their own take on the situation.
Yeah.
they have a very effective news structure, right? Where their newspaper, their TV station, all of their media presence on social media will like work very efficiently, so no one actually like stuff from real journalistic outlets won't even reach you because you're so flooded by all of the information and misinformation being shared by the government structure, and also their like proxy structure where they have a lot of like fake outlets display sharing information, but also like real looking outlets that are not real journalistic outlets. We know of a couple or more than a couple of like Facebook pages that or even some of them even have websites, and they're made to feel like you're reading a real newspaper site, but they're not, right? There's no journalism work behind that. There's pure propaganda at the end. Yeah, this adds up to this bigger information strategy that they run with, I think, the objective of people not really ever getting to the actual news. And if you do it through them, and you already have this idea that they're lying to you, and therefore you won't even go read the actual piece or sort of question whether what you read before from the government is or isn't real. You just sort of like believe everyone's like lying about the government and their policies, and whatever they say must be true. And they have created effectively this monopoly on information in El Salvador, and that's something that keeps affecting the whole way that news works. So that means it's affecting people writing the stories, people reading or not reading the stories, and they've managed to sort of like take over how people and information sort of play with each other right now.
I was going to ask you originally as my closing questions, like, what do you think is important to cover right now? Like, what are the topics that you really think should be in the news that maybe aren't as often? But I think I also want to ask you, how should we cover them, right? Given this wall of disinformation or fake news and intimidation and self-censorship, right? Like, so what and how?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff happening in El Salvador that we don't really pay attention to. Of course, there's like El Salvador is being the protagonist of this massive human rights issue that will come back to bite El Salvador. There will for sure see some international court case, and that's something that is still going on. It's gonna keep happening, and definitely, I think journalism shouldn't stop having a spotlight on those sort of issues. But also, there is this whole economic restructuring happening in the country, and the fact that the families surrounding the Bukeles are the new owners of a ton of like hotels and resorts and new businesses in the agricultural field and in tourism, and now El Salvador has this huge influx of tech-related businesses. There's a lot of money going in and out of El Salvador, and I think we shouldn't forget that, right? Also, the fact that this all of the new money is sort of like displacing a lot of like poor people, and the fact that all of the like structural causes that took us to the problem with the gangs are still happening. There's still the failing education system, a failing health system, and these are the underlying problems that took us to this like huge crisis with armed groups and gangs right before, and that's something that shouldn't be left without someone keeping track of what's going on, because it will eventually take us back to that same place. But also regarding the how, I think this is a big issue for news outlets, because part of the world of news is still stuck in the 70s, thinking everyone loves
the 5,000 word essay.
And
people read the print versions of newspapers, and that's definitely something that is not happening anymore. But El Salvador's outlets are also sort of late to the subscription model game, and like having people understand that maybe they need to pay a little bit more for news. So I think the media outlets have a big struggle to understand how El Salvador wants to consume their media now, consume their news, and also not being so blinded by the idea that anything like related to social media is the new way to have people get their news, because there's still a lot of people that don't have access to the internet in El Salvador. So I believe there's a whole discussion to be had by the media outlets if they want to continue surviving and doing what they're doing, because definitely this is very easily seen in the newspapers, because you can see how they're sort of like shrinking, getting thinner and thinner each year. So if they want to continue publishing, they have to find a new way that actually includes people, right? A way that doesn't mean a farmer that hasn't or barely knows how to read has to read a 10-page article to figure out what happened to government funds, or it's something that it doesn't only apply to El Salvador, of course, but the wider media world. But definitely Salvadoran outlets have to think about how they're gonna swim through this current, because if not, they're gonna be
pulled out by the tide, baby.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Humberto. I really appreciate the time you took to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
What you just heard was real. But to avoid some of those pesky potential consequences, Humberto's voice was altered for his own protection. The irony of doing so in this episode is not lost on me. But that's self-censorship in action, bichos. Regardless, thanks for listening, surfers. Tune in real soon for our environmental episode, where we discuss the birds, the bees, the flowers, and the trees, and the gold buried deep underground, as we talk about El Salvador's anti-mining movement and why environmentalists are having such a rough time out here. Our theme music is thanks to the talents of Paco Casanova, George Fierro, and Guille. Salud!